Welcome, everyone, to the AdDot podcast. It's Vaughn Vernon here. I'm your host, and I have today with me Daniel Lübke, and he's one of the co-authors of a new book, Patterns for API Design. This is a book in my Addison Wesley Signature Series, and very happy that I have met Daniel and his co-authors to explain just a bit the book. I'll do that in a moment, but I want to welcome Daniel first to the podcast. Welcome, Daniel.
Yeah, hello, and thanks for having me on your podcast. Hello, everyone who listens to this.
Just to explain a bit about the book, in terms of the co-authors, there are 5 co-authors altogether. I guess the lead co-author was Olaf Zimmermann. He's German, but has been in Switzerland for quite a while now. And Olaf was working with IBM for, a number of years, maybe 18 or 20 years or something. I apologize if I'm not exactly correct about that, just from my memory. But he's now a professor in a university in Switzerland, and a number of the co-authors, 3 in fact total, are 4 now are professors. Daniel Lübke is one of the co-authors who is working in industry, and Mirko Stocker did work in industry up until very recently, where he got a professorship as well. So there's a good blend of industry experience and viewpoint from academia, and I think that's pretty cool to have that kind of blend together. So what did you think about having this team?
Well, I think it's very important to have this team, or at least it was very beneficial. So you have people running around in projects, so the industry guys who usually work and have all these problems, but don't have time usually to really go deep into things. And then you have people at universities, be it professors or PhD students, who usually have time but don't see these problems very much. And so this is a complementary team. So we from the industry side could say, okay, these are problems we encounter, these are solutions we are seeing. So also help that, Olaf was, I think at Global Services, but at IBM, but at least in consultancy, and I'm as well, and Mirko also did lots of projects, sometimes in parallel. So we saw some organizations, we saw typical solution strategies, and so this is what we brought in. And on the other hand, Uwe and Cesare both had written patterns before, so they knew how these templates work, what to document, where to look for, which things to contribute. And in the end, this worked quite well, I must say. Yeah.
Good. And yes, I have to agree, as series editor, having the early look at your book, and even just knowing some of you, mostly I knew, I was most familiar with Olaf. We had met just amazing shortly before the pandemic lockdown, about a little more than 3 months before, and we kept in touch and had some conversations along the way, and I was very interested in and impressed by the work he was doing at the university in open source software, along with his assistant and developer there. So it all came together as a great opportunity to work together. So I'm glad that happened. So let's kind of get into this discussion about your book. There are already many pattern collections, books on patterns. I don't know, what was it, 1992, 93 maybe, that Design Patterns book, the Gang of Four Patterns book came out. I don't remember for sure, but maybe it was around that time. And since then, there have been a number of patterns books. And a lot of those are considered classics. The POSA books, POSA 1 through, I don't know, is it 5 now? Something like that. And even if you go back to PLOP, the Pattern Languages of Programs, I think it is the name of that group. There were even books published out of those sort of, I guess, not conferences, but kind of like patterns workshops where they would get together and work on patterns together far back. What makes this such a good, sort of unique patterns book? Why write it?
Yeah, I think there are two parts to this answer. So one is, as you noted, there are many patterns books out there which are deemed classic. So it's not that patterns you write in just 3 years, they're superseded by some different technology. So patterns capture experience, and they capture this usually in a technology neutral way. Yeah, so if we look at Gang of Four, I think it's one of the most successful books, although no one buys it anymore, but everyone knows what an iterator or listener is. It's so frequently used in our language and even our programming languages that, it's definitely a success. And also, if we look at enterprise integration patterns, we have all these things which we use in our day-to-day language. So I think that's the first thing. Patterns are really there to stay if they are well done. And then the question is, what do these patterns contribute in addition to all the other patterns books? And I think we found, a niche. Well, what means found? It's going back again to our project experience. When Olaf approached me, it was actually quite good timing. So the story is we were raised, only some kilometers apart, but we met in a workshop back in Hanover in 2007. And then for many years we didn't meet until we both were in Zurich, in Switzerland. And then I think it was 2016, he approached me and asked, okay, I have this idea for pattern language for APIs. And at that time I was in a project which was very large scale and where we had new API designers. Back then it was service designer. So also terminology has changed a bit. And I was really frustrated by explaining many things over and over again. And this was somehow my motivation to tackle this project. So answering those things which weren't documented already. And these were part of, more the API payload. I think in contrast to other pattern languages which are more concerned with architectural roles we also have design choices, but more out of message design choices. We're really having patterns which going to the structure, what you put into your requests and responses. And no one has done this before. Although we frequently do this, and I think if you look at the pattern catalog, there are things you will definitely notice, like pagination. That's something which we all do once and over again. But no one really has put this into pattern form. So what are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? What variants do you have? And I think that's one of the great strengths of this book, that we have closed this gap between the architectural things and then really going down to the technical books where you discuss how our HTTP works.
Yeah, and I think too that patterns have been getting kind of bashed over the past, maybe 2 years. I've seen a lot of negative comments about patterns. We don't need patterns. And this isn't just coming from the sort of functional programming world, which may or may not be accurate, but actually coming from, the typical object-oriented, not even that those projects are object-oriented, but using object-oriented languages. And what I've found is that a lot of this bashing comes from kids who are being paid a lot of money by FANG and other companies. And I think they sort of feel like, hey, we just know everything. And my prediction is that they're going to come out of this reinventing patterns, whether they call them patterns or not. They're going to say, oh, I've seen this before. And this must be maybe the second or third time I've used this, and let me write it down so that other people can learn from it and use it later. And then all of a sudden, we've got like this 2 ages of patterns or something like that. And I just don't think it's fair. And there's a lot of wisdom in our industry, people who have been writing patterns for ages, I guess. In internet terms, it's probably been like 6-7 generations of pattern writing, so to speak, right? And so I think it's quite important and a great statement to come back to this, and say, nah, patterns still matter, right? I think it's quite important.
And well, we see this, what you described with patterns. We also already saw this like in the 2000s, where the Gang of Four book was bashed, and still is on YouTube. Actually, I was quite astonished that there's a quite new video of someone who was telling that's all not necessary and we don't need this. And I think the first misunderstanding these people make is that you must use these patterns. So it's no competition to use as many patterns as you can, but it's to find the correct pattern, the correct design concept to your problem. And so that's why this pattern format is quite nice. So you see, what are the influencing forces? What do I get, and what do I make worse as well? So it's not no decision just as positive. And patterns capture this quite well, I think. And the other aspect, and I think you're quite right on that, is in general we are reinventing many things. So I hope that I'm not that old, but still, when I was at university myself, CORBA saved the world, and then XML, and consequently SOAP saved the world, and then REST saved the world. And I don't know what's now going to be the savior, but at all these breaks between technologies, many things were just discarded by people who said, okay, we don't need this. It's too complex and it's too difficult. And then while these technologies evolve, you add on the same things again because the problems are still there. And then perhaps you just look into your pattern catalog, also enterprise integration patterns. I think it's the same. So it was a book, when it was released, it was quite famous, and then for a while it was nothing. And then moving back things into the cloud, all these concepts are reappearing, and also the interest in these patterns are reappearing as well.
For sure. So overall, what would you say was the motivation for documenting these patterns? Maybe you noted your own experience, and there was Olaf, but sort of if you combined everybody's thoughts about this, what was the kind of overarching motive?
I think it was really collecting experience and putting it out there in an accessible way. I think that's the common denominator. So with slight differences, like I said, I had some project experience back in that day. Olaf was looking probably at his teaching. We had these pattern guys, so Uwe and Cesar, who both were interested in doing these things. And Mirko, I don't know what his personal motivation was, but I think it was along these lines, because when we worked in a team, it was really putting the reader first and making sure that you, as someone who's designing an API, know what decisions you have to make and what you get for these decisions or possible solutions. I think that was really the overall thing. So documenting something, putting it in a nice package, and then getting it out to be used.
Yeah, and if you were to talk about the time involved in doing this, a lot of people want to write a book, as I say in preface to Strategic Monoliths and Microservices. I think that the number of people who actually write books after they say they want to write books is probably about the same as the number of people who say they want to dive with great white sharks and actually do dive with great white sharks, right? So what does it look like to write a book like this, especially with 5 co-authors? That must be sort of like the partnership from a messy place or something sometimes.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing is that we never, possibly too hard as a statement, but the first goal was never to write a book. So we have now written a book without wanting to write a book. So we started by collecting these patterns, and this goes back to 2016. So it's 6 years ago, quite a while, where we had the first sketches of what things we want to document. And that worked quite well, was we were going to these Europlop conferences, as you mentioned, which are really great workshops. And we put each pattern category there every year. So a new one every year. So in 2017, the first pattern structure, and then quality, evolution, responsibility patterns. And this was good because you had some externally defined milestones. So you had the workshop deadlines. You knew who was interested in these categories, so who would contribute more in this year. And at these pattern workshops, you really got feedback from many, many people. And that was really, really good. And then we said, okay, we have now published this on our website. We have these Europlop papers. Now we have enough to really build a book, which seemed to be the next logical step. And we thought it's just writing this up because we're content complete. So we started the book from a content complete milestone. But still it took us 2 years. So really getting consistency into the things which evolved over many years, making figures consistent, adding text. We haven't some chapters are completely new, like decision models, and also industry case descriptions. And I mean, we are not full-time authors. I think that's also important. So all 5 who were involved in this really have their day-to-day jobs. Except Olaf, I think, took some time off in between just to concentrate on this book. But for all others, it was a kind of a hobby. And so naturally, this took a bit longer. But on the other hand, I think if you don't rush these things, you're getting quite a high level of quality out of it. So really, these pattern workshops were really great on improving our patterns, having the website up and getting there also feedback from industry people who just emailed us and said, well, that's great. I would love to have this before some years ago. And this was motivating, and this helped us to refine things. Yeah, and then, all in all, it has been 6 years. And I think, but also their team is good to keep you there. I think if you write a book alone, it's easier to just say, no, it's not important for me now, I cancel the project. But if you're in a team, someone is motivated and someone will push the others until they are motivated again or have time again.
Yeah, very true. I have found that having a co-author is, it just introduces better solutions in some way and more complexity in other ways. It's a trade-off, right? Like almost everything we do in software is a trade-off. Like even becoming a software developer in the first place. But I do know what you mean when, like I have been introduced before as an author, and I really dislike that because almost no technical authors can afford to be authors only, and you would not be a successful author if you were just an author, right? Like how can you expect to not be a software developer or a very good software developer and write a successful book? So yeah, we all have jobs, and sometimes we get opportunities to spend time other than, in addition to our jobs that opens up to us. But I can tell you that I'm the follow-up book that Tomasz and I are working on now. We're just barely, like millimeter by millimeter getting work done because we're so busy on other things, and it's a real challenge. And yet you want to help, you want to keep helping. But please, if you if you think you want to write a book, you're listening to this, just understand it would be a grand exception if you were able to actually retire on your book earnings, or, like, think that you didn't ever have to work in industry again. That's very unlikely to happen.
No, and I think it shouldn't also be the goal, right? So I think, like you said, so you need to be a developer, or at least have some kind of technical role, and you need to work on the contents in the sense you really need to have hands-on experience, because otherwise it's just a theoretical book, and it will have no meaningful content in a sense. And so, you should know what you're writing about, and this means you're a part-time author at best, and then you should do this just to improve the craft. And I think also computer science, although it's quite a large field, it's still a niche, so it's not like we are writing Harry Potter. So we'll definitely sell fewer books with our topics.
Yeah, for sure. And we're not writing these fictional blockbuster type books, for sure. And now, I did think it was quite interesting that the book started as basically a website, right? Like it wasn't a book. The motivation was, let's provide like this open source guidance for people. It was kind of my fault that it became a book. I mean, maybe you would have, as a team later, said, hey, could we find a publisher for this for a book? But in staying in touch with Olaf since the pandemic lockdown, we eventually got around to talking about this, website and the project. And right away, I think I had just had received the offer from Addison Wesley to have a signature series. And so, with these two kinds of knowledge in mind, I was like, Olaf, why would you not be interested in turning this into a book? And he was like, I think I've never thought of that before. So, it's quite interesting how that came about, and I'm happy that we did. So first, like maybe a next question along that line is, do you really need a team? And if you have a team, how do you collaborate together to actually make it work? You've touched on that a bit, but I think it's a good segue.
Yeah, well, I don't know whether you really need a team. So all book projects have been author or editor I've did with other people. So not 5, but at least 2. I think if you're disciplined and experienced enough, you can write a book yourself. But probably if there's someone just thinking about writing his or her first book, I would probably say just get one partner at least, and keep you motivated. And then collaboration, it's like in software development. There are more parallels than writing a book then. And one is definitely version control. And what we did is, which is probably completely, strange setup, is we used Markdown actually to write our texts. And from this Markdown, we had different generators. So all these papers for these plop conferences, we generated the LaTeX and then the PDFs from Markdown. Also the homepage we did from the same source. And then for the book, we branched the patterns and had some generators who would generate the Pearson Word template for us. And that has some advantages. So we used Git, and you get all these nice diffs, and you can see who changed what, and that's really nice. What you don't get is, what you see is what you get feeling. So you need to recompile things. You need to push your changes and then see how the homepage looks. But overall, if you have 5 people working on different things, having more or smaller files, especially, so even if we would have used Word, it would have been a bad idea to just use one large file. We naturally would split this at least into chapters. And we had this on a pattern basis. So we had one file for each pattern. We had then obviously other files for the non-pattern chapters. And that worked quite well. So you have comments in the source code where you could just annotate things where I could say, okay, DL as my shorthand, I write some comments, some questions. And like I said, you have a plain text format. You can use all the different version control tools like you would have on Java code or whatever code you like to use. And that was quite nice, although it's a very technical setup. So I'm sure that's not for everyone. So there are people definitely who would prefer to use some more comfortable tools, which are geared towards text processing. But that's how we did it. And in the end, it's not perfect, but it was nice, especially that we had these generators for having these different targets. And we didn't need to reformat things and do all this crazy stuff.
And for the generation of the website, we're using something like Hugo or one of those static generators.
I must admit that Lübke did this. And I think it was Jekyll for the website.
Mm-hmm.
From
similar
London.
tool. Yeah, cool.
So
how do you write a pattern or codify a pattern? What, some people might say, how do you create a pattern, right? What does that entail?
Yeah, well, the interesting thing is you don't create a pattern. Well, it's called mining, although I think it's a strange term. But what you do is you look for things which you encounter really in practice. So usually the rule of thumb is you need to find a solution 3 times before you may call it a pattern. And then there are different templates, but more or less they contain a name, which is supposedly the most important element. Then you have forces, which this pattern addresses, and then you have benefits, drawbacks, a solution sketch, usually an example. And that's what you then fill with what you see in the solutions you find in real life. And I mean, they're nice discussions. So I think everyone learned quite a lot by formalizing these patterns. So like I said, pagination is something which everyone uses, but still when we wrote and commented and reviewed this pattern, everyone I think was more knowledgeable later than he was before. And probably the most discussions you have with the names, because I mean, in the end, the goal is that people use this name as a synonym for this whole solution, and that what the Gang of Four really did well. So we're using these names without thinking much about that, and they very clearly describe what the solution is. And so we had many discussions, and the problem there is that sometimes some patterns really have different names by different communities. And so we settled for one, which we found the best. We also put there a list of synonyms, what we found on other names and other people used. But yeah, in the end, it's really working through this template, looking for what does this pattern improve, what will be negative impacts, what's a good example, and then change the name again to make it better. So I think for some patterns, we really changed the name 3 or 4 times. So really until we said, okay, it's really describing what it means.
Yeah, I've heard that naming is hard.
Yeah, I've heard that before.
And that's why we call these pattern languages, right? Okay, it's only a pattern language if the patterns form a language, right? In other words, they belong together, they complement one another and so forth. But you are creating a language around the pattern, and it becomes recognizable for anyone who is using the pattern. So then, let's talk about that for a moment. How do you actually use patterns in a project? How do you know that you need to apply some pattern or any number of them?
Well, in the end, I don't think someone really searches for or shouldn't should search for how many patterns go in there. So you will identify problems which you have, and these problems should be addressed somehow. And then there are some people who just will do anything, and then there will be people who draw from their experience, and then there will be people who draw from others' experience, and patterns are captured experience from many people. So what you look for is, well, your problem and what you want to improve from a quality side. Do you want to improve scalability? Do you want to improve some kind of performance metrics? Do you want to improve understandability of things, or maintainability, evolvability? And what are you going to sacrifice for that? And if you then know patterns, you probably have some idea which pattern will address your constellation and your context properly. But in the end, I think, and that's at least which is interesting for me to see. I mean, I know obviously all these patterns in our book, so but still, I have a very short list of these patterns, or the overview graphic of from our homepage, and then when I design an API, I just check off things. So I just cross them through. If I say it's not applicable, or put a question mark. If I say, okay, I don't know whether this is something I'm going to use, or I just put a check mark on things where I think it's going to help. And this kind of a checklist is interesting also for experienced people. So we, like say you get a pull request and you need to review some API description. And then it helps to have something which guides you. And these patterns can really serve as a checklist, or these forces, these quality attributes. Has the author of this API thought about, well, the result set size? Can this be huge? And should something be done about that? So should we truncate it, paginate it? Should we make configurable like GraphQL or something like that? And so this really helps, because we have so many dimensions on quality attributes that you're likely, if you don't do this structuredly, you're likely to miss some. So for me, it's really went into kind of checklist things. So I take an overview and just really use that as a checklist.
Yeah. And, you touched on something there that I recall recently. Someone posted some advice and discussed, these are my favorite patterns to use. And I just thought, what? What? So it's a goal to use these patterns in anything. I would say that if there's any pattern whatsoever that just like throw something out there that is kind of a go-to pattern, is probably like ports and adapters architecture. Maybe, right? Like probably in a lot of line of business projects, products, I think that ports and adapters make sense. And then if you're using domain-driven design, there are a few there, but I don't enter a project saying it is my goal, or I'm going to use my favorite patterns here because they're my favorite patterns. There is no goal like that, right? It's just, what do you need? And exactly. And recognizing the need.
Yeah. But I think this problem goes further. So people just presetting frameworks, programming languages, deployment technologies whatsoever, because they are somehow used to that, and they just never ask themselves, is that a good idea in this new project or in this new context? And they just say, okay, that's how I did it the last 10 years or 5 years or whatever, and I will just continue without thinking about that. And the goal is never to use as many patterns as you can. It's using the correct ones for your context. And it might be even 0, which is totally fine. So I don't need to sell this book by counting how many instances of a pattern are in any project worldwide. It's to the contrary. It's if people make conscious choices and our description of these patterns help them make these choices really consciously and structurally, then that's really an advancement, and not just I know every pattern and I need to show off and introduce everything so that my teammates are jealous. And no, it's really picking the right tool for the job. And I think in programming we are quite bad at that in general, because we have some fashions, some hypes, and then everyone is doing this newest technology. Like I said, every 5 or 10 years, a new technology saves the world, and no, it doesn't. So
these days, it's every 6 months, I think, or something like that. Yeah. Okay, so I think I counted, just going very quickly through the table of contents. Are there about 45 patterns in your book, something like that? Yeah.
Yep.
And so, yeah, I mean, can you imagine that we have to use all 45 patterns to say that we're getting value out of purchasing the book, or do, like, I don't know, how economy of scale or something. Well, did Christopher Alexander use every pattern that he wrote about in every building, that he created an architecture for? No, of course not. And, so.
No, and you can't actually, because some patterns, like if you look at the evolution category, so there are things which you can choose one, but not all. So you can do tool in production, or you can do experimental previews. But you can't do both, or likely at least on one API, you can't do both. And that's the same with other patterns. So, and that's, I think you talked about a pattern language and how patterns are connected. And I think in a good pattern language, you have alternatives, which gives you, for the same problem under different circumstances, give you different solutions. And if we take the example, I have too much data which I return. So between GraphQL and pagination, there are many different options. And you're likely to choose one and not try to stack all on top of each other, just to make things more complex. But you need to know which route to go and which exit, so to say, to take, which pattern to take. And I mean, people ask me, do I need to read all of this? I mean, it's quite a large book, nearly 500 pages. And no, I don't think you need to read it at the first time end to end, cover to cover. But you should, in your mind, you should have a hash table of what patterns are there and what problems are addressed. And if you have this, and then you're on a project and see, okay, I now have this problem, and I might not even know the pattern name, but I know that there was a pattern in this book. Then I'll find this pattern, and then I can use it.
Yes, and in your book, I think you just mentioned it, is it related patterns, right? So maybe this is what you would use if there was some trade-off that you would prefer not to have the downside of that particular trade-off, then consider these other patterns which could help either, overcome the negative part of the trade-off, or maybe it's an alternative that you would use instead. Would that be it? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, and also, I mean, that's one of the things which aren't on the website, but which a chapter in the book, which is a whole chapter on decision making, which gives you decision trees for these problems. So you can see, okay, I have this problem, and there are these 3 or 4 patterns which might address this. And all will, like you said, will strengthen certain things and will weaken certain things in my solution. And that's why you can't say I always go with pagination. Oh, that's my favorite pattern. I use pagination all the time. Sometimes I don't need it because I know it's only going to be 10 records being returned. And sometimes it might be the wrong solution because my client has other needs than fetching pages and pages and pages again. And I think that's one of the advantages the book has over the homepage, is this chapter, which really guides you by these decision trees and some explanations for this, how these patterns really relate to one another.
One of the things that I noted from the past is that Ward's wiki, Ward Cunningham's wiki, c2.com, has maybe you would call it a meta pattern or something. It's called the rule of three. And this is where it at least used to be stated that there should be three uses of this pattern in industry before you would be able to write it as a pattern, right? Like to codify the pattern, because otherwise maybe it's not really a pattern. Now, I've heard that there's kind of a change in that, that pattern authors don't necessarily go by that anymore, but it's interesting that there used to be this rule of three. Can you speak to how, was that a decision factor for you? Like, okay, we've seen this enough times to know it's definitely a pattern, or how did you like that kind of decision making on the pattern?
Yeah, well, both directions. So we included patterns where we found, and usually we found much more than 3 instances of that. I mean, we have now so many APIs, both in organizations where we worked and also publicly. So you find many of these things. But also from the book, we excluded one pattern because we actually could just only find one instance of that being used. And then we said, okay, that's probably not relevant, neither for the reader nor for us to spend our time really doing all the formal work on documenting that. But I think this rule is important, and I know that some pattern authors are trying to work around that. But still, you're not a pattern creator. You're trying to just gather other people's experience, and if there are not at least 3 people telling you, at least by some software artifacts, that they thought that's a good idea, then, well, you're back to creating patterns. And the main benefit of a pattern is that it's really codified experience. And if you don't have this rule of 3, you lose that. And that's why I think it's good to still adhere to that rule. And like I said, we really throw out one pattern, which we have and still have on our homepage, but it's not in the book because we just couldn't find more than one instance of that being used.
Yeah, good. And just, so the audience knows as well, when I first started talking to Olaf about this, and I think even the first proposal that he turned in to Addison Wesley, which I looked at, and there was a lot of sort of domain-driven design, DDD support planned for the book. And I know that you as co-authors have referenced DDD in several cases, but I remember telling Olaf, look, this doesn't have to be a DDD book. I'm hoping that most of the books in my series they're going to support DDD in some way, but they don't have to be DDD. And I think that's why your book is only 500 pages. so 500 pages, it's considered a big book these days, but my red book was more than 600. And I think Eric's blue book is right around 600, maybe, somewhere up there. And so that's a big subject in itself. I'm not saying that Olaf or any of you were planning on talking about DDD from the ground up or, every single detail of it, but I'm happy that you noted where there's overlap, or at least uses within DDD, and how maybe certain patterns were influenced by domain-driven design types of decisions, model decisions, and so forth. But it clearly is not a DDD book. It's an API patterns book, which is great to my mind.
Yeah, definitely. And also, I think if you look at the first draft, it had much more side topics, and I think it's good that we stripped this down. Also, I think one factor was to align this with other books in your series, and really, abstracted more, isolated more. So if for whatever reason DDD shouldn't be that hyped anymore, then still these patterns would stand. But still we have all these references and to DDD and also to other methodologies and to other books and other patterns, just to say, okay, that's a landscape. So you're right here now, you're designing your API, you're designing your API payloads, but usually you're also obviously in a project context, and perhaps you're doing DDD, and then you can look there, because there you find the description for things which relate at this point or to this pattern. And the same for microservices. So when we started, microservices were just new and, well, hyped again. And the initial name was Microservice API Patterns. And still, we didn't notice, because at the time, with all this hype, it was natural to call it that way. But it was a bad name, because these patterns by itself are very agnostic of the architecture. Every architecture today has some kind of API. And especially distributed architectures have many, many APIs. And we now see microservices being reshaped, or people say, okay, we are now moving back to monolithic systems, but still they will have APIs. So why should we entangle our patterns with microservices? We don't need to. We give pointers. So if you have microservices, then we give you pointers where you can read and see how these patterns relate to microservices concepts. But I think really, if you look at the book now on the table of contents compared to this first proposal, that it's sharpened and that the context is much clearer, and that we refactor out code. We refactored out contents and just replaced it by references to books which would cover this in much more detail than we could do this.
Yeah.
Like you said, I mean, there are very good DDD books out there, as you might know. And why should we write chapters over chapters repeating those things?
Yeah. And I'm very happy that you wrote a very sound, wise guidance for API design patterns that is really needed. And so what's the feedback so far? I mean, you told me, or I think I saw it somewhere, that you actually hit number 1 on Amazon.
Yeah, it's crazy.
That's pretty good feedback.
Yeah, I mean, the feedback overall has been amazing. It has been unreal. So, I mean, if you look at least how I feel, so we worked really a long time, like 6 years. And at the beginning, it was new, and you thought it was new. And then after 6 years, you get so accustomed to it that you say, yeah, it's good content, but you know it inside out. It's not special anymore for you at this moment. So after 6 years, it's not special. You're happy that the book is done, that the publisher has it, and you get your copies, and you're proud, and that's nice. But then something happened, and this has not happened to any of my other books before. So people on LinkedIn just put this out, like Gregor Hooper or Eric Wilde. So people who really have a huge network of followers, and they praised this book. And then all these people just liked it. And then it came available on Amazon a bit later. And then we hit for the used books or book releases, we had number 1 in computer programming. And that's unreal to a certain extent. So, but it's great, because it really shows you it was worth working so many years on this book, and that people now say, yeah, that's great. And even big names are coming or mailing to you. Yeah, that's a gap, and it's now great that I can refer people in my project to this book and to this catalog. And so far it has been a great experience after this release. So it was very, very well received in a way I couldn't have imagined before.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I've hit that number 1 before, and not just one book in it. And it's pretty amazing, actually. You wonder if anyone at all is going to like this book or ever read it, and it hits number 1, and you're just you sort of don't know what to say other than, wow, my book just hit the bestseller, number 1 on bestsellers. So yeah, it's a great feeling, and it makes all the hard work seem worthwhile. I would say it does.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely.
And 6 years, nearly, I don't know, was it exactly, not quite 6 maybe, but pretty close to 6 years. That's a long time to work on any project, software project, anything, right? And yeah, so
yeah, and then the release is just before Christmas, so it's a great gift, yeah, great Christmas present.
That seems to be a popular thing to do. So, now this is going to be an odd question, I think, because we've already talked in the negative about this question. But what is your favorite pattern? Now, I'm not saying that like, what is your favorite pattern that you use all the time and you always use it? Maybe it's like, well, which one do you think was the most interesting to codify, or, you know, maybe overall the most useful, or the most complex one to deal with, or something like that? Anything like that?
Yeah, I think there are two which are interesting from this perspective. One is definitely pagination, because if you just go out and tell any programmer, yeah, well, we need to do pagination, or you look or Google it, then you will find these blogs, well, how to do pagination, and it's simply inserting some parameters into your Hibernate or whatever object relational mapper you're using. And then you look at this a bit more in detail, and you see, okay, that's only one of the variants which you have, and there are two others, and these two others are usually performing much faster from a performance perspective if you get this to your database. And that's something which I somehow knew, but never actually gotten deep into it. And having these three variants in one pattern was very challenging, because you really needed to make sure that the reader understood, is this applicable to all variants, or is this something which only applies to one? And in between, we really thought about splitting this into three, because it was so complex. So cohesion was a problem to remain in, to use software engineering terms. And very interestingly for me, well, I think it was half a year later when we finished this pattern, more or less, the pagination pattern, I was at a client project, and they really had this problem of performance and pagination by using the simple Hibernate approach. And it was quite handy to say, yeah, well, I have something up my sleeve. There are other variants. I'll just quickly prototype this for you, and you can see how these others perform. And they actually then switched over to a more ID-based pagination approach. So in that sense, this was definitely one of the more challenging patterns to write, because of sheer the amount of information variants which are in there. Although it seems to be like everyone knows this, and I think most people just know the general idea in one variant. So I think also for readers who are not really experts in pagination, you will find something really useful and new in this pattern. And the second one is different. It's context representation. So you're transmitting some metadata of your request, like message IDs, correlation tokens, and you bundle this into a special section, like in payload header, so to say. And that's something which I thought is, common practice. So, the beginning of my career was at Swiss banks, insurances, and internally they did this. So it was part of their infrastructure. They used this for logging, for auditing. And still, when I did the first presentations about our pattern project, it was people, hey, that's a great pattern. I didn't know this. And we have all these problems because we have the message IDs, but in every API, it's called differently. And so that was for me, interesting, so to say, because the pattern itself is easy. Writing it was easy, but from the initial feedback, it had quite an impact on people realizing what they are doing. And it was, amazing somehow.
Yeah, very interesting. I would have to say that if someone, again, is just doing the go-to Hibernate or JPA or entity framework, I know how to do pagination, I can pretty much guarantee, I won't say guarantee, but that's probably one of the least performant ways to go about doing that. And so hopefully people are learning that although there is a lot of OR mapping out there, OR mapping is well, it's just not the necessarily even the easiest way to go about it these days with the kinds of databases that we have, features in databases. You can get a lot of mileage that OR mapping, kind of covers without using OR mapping. But leave that to the implementer, right? The designers.
Yeah, it's probably its own podcast in itself.
Yeah, exactly. Which I should do. In fact, I can think of someone right now who probably I should interview about that, and I think he would disagree with me a lot, but that's okay.
I mean, it makes interesting discussions, right?
Yeah. So, okay, after all this is said and done, what have you learned from codifying these patterns, writing all this documentation that's ended up in book form? And I just have to say, you are permitted to say that one thing I learned is that I'll never write another book, but I would hope that you would say, no, I now feel sort of, more bold about writing another book, but I would choose to write a 200-page book in your series rather than a 500-page book or some, but what else have you learned?
Well, I think, the most prominent thing is I really learned about the contents myself. It's like always, if you write something down, if you try to adhere to a template to formalize things, you realize what you don't know, and then you read about this or think about it, and you are getting better at it. And like I said, my trigger for doing this project was that I wanted to teach other people who were in my project and where I had to explain things. And I realized, perhaps in some areas, it's good that you wrote the book because you're now much better instructor. And that's something which is natural if you think about that. I mean, this effect we all know. So writing things down makes you think about it and leads to better solutions. But still, it surprised me by what degree this happened in this book. So that's, I think, my number one takeaway. Concerning whether I would write another book, yes, I was actually asked by people whether I would write a book with them on other topics, more workflow automation. And I said, I answer that after Christmas. At least I need some weeks to not writing a book and recover a bit and get myself sorted. But in the end, no, I would definitely write a book again. Whether it would be 500 pages or 200, I don't know. It probably depends on the topic. But I would never agree to finish this in a year. So I would always start with the idea and write a rough manuscript, and then I know, okay, I'm now ready to go and present this to some external person. Because what I learned also is I'm bad at estimating things with book projects. So I would rather not estimate any release date or handing over to a publisher.
Yeah, it's not easy, and most future authors, put it that way, most future authors have missed their deadlines from the beginning, right? And I, even during, in writing strategic monoliths and microservices, that book came about shortly into the lockdown. And Tomasz and I, and especially it's my fault, I thought that we could write 2 books within the lockdown because I thought the lockdown would, and I mean like the intense part of lockdown, right, where nobody was doing anything, everything was frozen, which ended up being about 6 to 7 months. But then after 6 months, things started getting busy again, and wow, talk about, it just became more challenging. And then after 9 months, when we actually had completed the first manuscript, not 9 months in, I would say, is what I'm talking about. It just became way busier than we ever thought. So just, like you said, you have to temper your enthusiasm for what you want to write about with the realities that, you still have to please clients, and they may be interested in you writing a book, but only after it's done. They're not interested in you writing a book right now, right? They just want you to get their work done. So yeah, but that would be cool. Yeah, more topics that you have experience with, then that would be great. So look forward to that. Do you have any sort of parting advice for readers, or maybe how to contact you, or what, how you might help others on their projects?
Yeah, well, like I said, so if you have the book, and you don't have much time, just try to get to know each patent. You don't need to read it from cover to cover, and really try to use it as a checklist when you design your next API or you review your next API. And well, we have our homepage, which also referenced in the book, and so you can use that as well. And there also our contact data is there, and hopefully next year we will also have our trainings on these patterns available. So if you like a more formal training, then you're also welcome to contact us. But in the end, it's just use it, and not use it in the sense, the more patterns the better, but in the sense, use the patterns which help you and no others. So that would be my advice.
Yeah.
Actually, for any pattern.
Yeah, you still have to use your brain, right? So
yeah,
brains are still really good. So, well, thank you so much, Danielle, and I look forward to getting together with you again. I look forward to having a podcast interview with Olaf soon, hopefully. I don't know. I think we have that one scheduled, hopefully. We'll keep in touch and look forward to your future work.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and I'm also looking forward to what you do in the future.